The Korea Cultural Heritage Foundation is conducting a survey on your satisfaction levels. If you can kindly fill them out and leave them on the tables, that will be helpful. So after lunch, we'd like to ask you to please fill out the survey forms on the tables. They are to seek your satisfaction levels regarding this event hosted by the Korea Cultural Heritage Foundation. Please leave them on the tables.
May I have your attention, please? Session 2 will begin shortly. So if you're still outside, please come inside and take your seats. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, we will soon begin session number 2. So please come inside and take your seats. We will soon begin. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Session 2 will begin shortly. Please come into the stage. And please wait for the beginning. 식사는 맛있게 하셨는데요.
We hope you enjoyed your lunch. And with that short video, we were able to open the second part of today's event, so the afternoon session. For this, we would like to turn to our moderator, Mr. Tim Curtis, who is the chief of the Living Heritage Entity, secretary of the Convention for the Safeguarding of ICH. We'd also like to hear from Honorable Mr. Ralph Regenavanu, Minister of Climate Change, Environment and Energy, Government of Vanuatu, Mr. Han Kyung-gu, Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, Ms. Karima Benu, former UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights and author of reports on culture, climate change, and cultural rights, Ms. Gulnara Aitspaeva, Director of the Ajin Cultural Research Center, Ms. Hindu Umaru, of co-chair International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate
Good
Change.
afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen.
We will watch the video first.
Sorry. The video later, I think. No, the video was supposed to come later. Sorry, I think the video comes a bit later. Give me... No. Perhaps if I could ask the registrar to introduce the panel and the thematic and then show the video, if they can have a few minutes.
지금 오디오가 잠시 되지 않아서.
Yes, I feel that there are some technical issues, so perhaps we'd like to hear the introduction of the
Thank you.
panelists first, and then we can turn to the
Excellencies,
video.
ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, colleagues, and dear participants, good afternoon and welcome back to this second session of this important celebration on living heritage and the natural world. I hope you had a good lunch after this morning's very rich contributions. My name is Tim Curtis, and I'm the secretary of the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. And I'm very pleased to be here today with a really exceptional panel, speaking on what I believe to be a very important theme, an important aspect of safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. Now, I think as has been explained, there's only 3 of us here, but I understand there's 3 important panelists who will participate online, and who I hope we should be seeing them on the screen. Today's theme is really of importance, of course, not only for the future of our convention. Here we have our panelists online, and I'll introduce them in a minute, but today's theme is of importance, of course, for our lives and for the entire planet. More and more, our very ways of life are becoming threatened by changes to the environment around us. We see every month, every day on the news, rising sea levels, flooding, drought, worsening wildfires. And these are displacing whole communities and destroying the places and resources needed for them to practice and transmit their intangible cultural heritage, their living heritage. At the same time, this living heritage carries with it environmental knowledge and practices that have been transmitted over generations and has some time-tested solutions for adaptations to challenges within those contexts. And in that sense, they may also give us time-tested solutions to mitigating some of these adverse effects we are suffering at the moment from our dysfunctional relationship with the natural world. And in that sense, ICH also has an important role in shaping and reaffirming the relationship we have with nature. And we can see many examples in the lists and in various forms of living heritage that help to foster and transmit values of respect, custodianship, and connectedness with nature. So understanding and valorizing these different values through safeguarding living heritage should be able to help us to think about new ways of building a sustainable relationship with our planet, new ways of conserving in a more holistic manner the world's biodiversity for future generations. And so the purpose of this panel is therefore to explore some of the challenges and contributions of living heritage to address issues around biodiversity loss, climate change, and our general environmental sustainability. And we're lucky to hear from perspectives and experiences from an impressive panel with experiences around the globe about how we might build on living heritage to restore our relationship with the natural world and develop more responsible and sustainable behaviors for our future. So today's roundtable will include a question to each of our 5 panelists who are joining us today. I will be introducing them as we go along, but before I begin, I think we have a short video from a youth participant from St. Kitts and Nevis who can help us to start our discussions. Could we have the video, please?
My name is Otis Jeffers of St. Kitts and Nevis. St. Kitts is one of the Leeward Islands in the Lesser Antilles. Many years ago, the indigenous Arawak tribe that inhabited the island made reference to St. Kitts as Liamega, which means fertile land. Agriculture was the main activity as a means of survival. Our fertile soil, along with its fresh water, abundant forests, was an attraction which influenced other settlers to heavily invest in our lands by growing of sugarcane. Today, while agriculture is still considered an activity which benefits thousands of citizens, including myself, I can predict that next 70 years, our fertile land will be considered to be degraded, making it less productive for agriculture. Modern agriculture, such as intensive tillage and heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, will lead to loss of soil fertility, water depletion, and climate change. To our local government, policy, and decision makers, help us in promoting even more living heritage as a way of educating the future generations using knowledge and techniques that has been transmitted in the community for generations, such as beekeeping, composting, zero tillage, agroforestry. The future depends on what we do today.
So that was, I think, a powerful message from Otis Jeffers from St. Kitts and Nevis, who really, I think, covered a number of issues that we'll be talking about today. And so I think with that, I'd like to go on and start with our 5 very esteemed panelists and to hear their perspectives on the topic. And it's a great honor for me to welcome as the first speaker His Excellency Honorable Mr. Ralph Regenvanu, who's joining us today from Vanuatu. Your Excellency, you are Vanuatu's Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Meteorology and Geohazards, Energy, Environment and Disaster Management. You have been also Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Lands. You have extensive experience working also before that with culture and including living heritage. You were a member of the International Drafting Committee of the 2003 Convention and on the first international jury of the UNESCO Proclamation of Masterpieces of Oral and Intangible Heritage of Humanity. And you were also instrumental in developing Vanuatu's National Sustainable Development Plan from 2016 to 2030. So thank you very much, Minister, for taking the time to be with us today. And I'd like to ask you why you think it's important to integrate intangible cultural heritage into national sustainable development plans, particularly for climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and disaster risk reduction. What do you see as the challenges that exist, and how do you think these can be addressed? Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And it's a real pleasure to be back here in the context of the Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage. Because as you said, Tim, I was involved for 5 years in drafting this convention, right from 1999 until it was passed by UNESCO in 2003. So I feel very close to the convention and how it was developed. And it's so great that we are now celebrating 20 years and all the fantastic work that has been done in valorizing this most critical element of our identities as humans living in this world. What is so important about the intangible cultural heritage is that essentially it is how we as humans have developed protocols or modalities or ways to live within the environments we are living in. So each culture in the world evolves in relation to its environment. And that's why our cultures are so different. And that's why we have different ways of conceptualizing the way we live, what we know about ourselves, our epistemologies, how we relate to each other, all the facets of what it means to be a social, living, cultural human being. So this interaction with the environment, between humans and the environment, is the essence of intangible cultural heritage. And therefore, the knowledge that is built up as a result of these interactions is essential for knowing how to properly live in these environments. And this was something that I think it was a very critical moment for the global community in Montreal in December last year, when in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the world passed the Montreal Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, which recognized explicitly for the first time that the ways people live in their environments are in fact the most effective ways of conserving biodiversity, conserving the natural environment in a way that is sustainable, much more so than, for example, states creating national parks. So this was a really, for me, a great step forward in the global understanding of what it means to properly manage our natural environment. And the sort of outcome from that I saw was that the world recognized that it is the living ways people live in their environment that are the most effective ways of preserving environments, particularly indigenous peoples and local communities who have been living in these environments for generations and know how they can survive and sustain themselves. And they know also that their survival depends on the sustenance of these environments. So in this context that we find ourselves now of climate change, we are seeing changes in the climate that are unprecedented in terms of their rapidity, in how fast it's happening compared to, for example, in the Pacific, my people, we have been living in the islands of Vanuatu for thousands of years. And we know our environments. We have some of the internationally recognized biological hotspots, biodiversity hotspots in our islands because the environments are so well preserved. And this is as a result of generations of intangible cultural heritage, traditional ecological knowledge, traditional resource management practices passed down from generation to generation as the intangible cultural heritage is. And this is what has enabled us to survive in these environments and prosper. In the context of climate change, it becomes increasingly important that we take aspects of that intangible cultural heritage that have helped us to survive and use them to adapt to the changing environment we find ourselves in. Climate change is happening, as I said, at an unprecedented rate. We've never experienced this level of change in our climatic conditions, the slow onset events such as sea level rise and the change in agricultural patterns where we can grow certain crops and where we can't, the change in the movement of species, particularly fish species in our oceans, also the ways in which we can predict the weather, the changes in the weather and the changes in the seasons and how we revolve our agricultural practices around this. We are also adapting our indigenous knowledge, our intangible cultural heritage, to this changing environment. And what we have found in Vanuatu, we developed a National Sustainable Development Plan, which I was part of, which aligns with the 15-year Sustainable Development Goals period that the United Nations has allotted from 2015 to 2030. We have 3 pillars: the economy pillar, the society pillar, the environment pillar, on a foundation which is our culture. And we recognize that the culture informs all of these pillars and all these ways we are going to be developing our country. And we are trying to use this knowledge as a way to make ourselves resilient. We've always been resilient in these environments because we've survived in them for so many years. But in that knowledge is the key also to our resilience. And so we are, of course, utilizing the latest Western science, but using it in a co-management model with our Indigenous knowledge, with our intangible cultural heritage, our ways of being, of living, of interacting, of expressing ourselves, of living in our environments, of sustaining ourselves. These are all aspects which have become critical to our National Sustainable Development Plan, our disaster risk resilience strategy, our climate change national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. There's a whole section on using our traditional knowledge and Indigenous cultural heritage, intangible cultural heritage as the basis for the actions we will take moving forward. And for us, it's become increasingly critical to have early childhood learning about their environment in that context of their own environment, learning from their elders about what the species are, what their movements are, what their behaviors are like, how do we use certain species in the environment for certain purposes. This is all essential knowledge for the survival of these young people we are bringing up into this world today. And so without that very learned and experienced interaction with the environment that is the basis of our cultural heritage, we would be kind of lost and rudderless moving into this future of uncertainty, climate change, and so on. But this provides a very important rudder, steering us, helping us to move in the right direction, because you know it's based on centuries of learned experience, which is the intangible cultural heritage of our people. Thank you, Tim. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you for sharing some really powerful ideas and experiences from Vanuatu, which I think, clearly on the front line also of the changes we're all facing, and it's very interesting to hear how you approach this, particularly in your role as a minister now for climate change and having been on the drafting panel for the convention itself. And we'd like to now go to another part of the world and to our second speaker, Ms. Hindu Umaru, who's joining us also online. Hindu, you are a co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and the United Nations Sustainable Development Advocate. You're a respected leader from Chad's Mbororo pastoralist community and a recognized supporter of Indigenous peoples' adaptation and mitigation efforts against climate change. You're also the president of the Association for Indigenous Peoples, for the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, from which you passionately advocate for increased participation and integration of Indigenous peoples' wisdom and traditions in the global fight against climate change. So, Ms. Umaru, I'd like to ask you why you believe it is critical to bring these voices of Indigenous people to the forefront of these discussions. What can the world learn from Indigenous peoples regarding our relationship with nature and to help us all tackle the crisis of climate change?
Thank you so much, team, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from my time. It's very early, so I apologize first for my energy. So thank you for welcoming me in this important discussion also, and I'm so sorry to do not join you in person. Team, today we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of this important convention on intangible cultural heritage. And these conventions is needed now than ever And as you name it, and also the excellency from Vanuatu name it, because of the climate change and biodiversity loss, we need these conventions now than ever. As indigenous peoples, we have always known that the value of our culture, our tradition, our knowledge is very important for fighting climate change and conserving the biodiversity. We as indigenous peoples, we are the bridge between our cultural heritage in the modern world. We live in harmony in this nature. We know how to conserve it, how to protect it. And this traditional knowledge is very essential for us as indigenous peoples, but also essential for all the rest of the world that wanted to put the effort to combat climate change and to preserve the biodiversity. His Excellency said, our land are the most high spot biodiversity around the world. That's why we are protecting the 80% of the world's biodiversity. Because our traditional knowledge, you can find all the solutions for adaptations, for resilience, for forestry, for ecosystem regenerations, just with our way of living. As pastoralists in my communities, we are the ones who are maintaining the soil to be more fertile, even with this climate change impact. We can find the most critical food even in the most drought season, or you can find the indigenous grandmother or grandfather who can find a food and fresh water even after a hurricane hitting their island in Pacific. So our way of living is best in protection of the nature. It is so important to have it in these discussions today, because our way of living is based on the 7 generations that are past. We learn from them. And when we take a decision, it's based on the 7 upcoming generations. So our way of living is based on the very long-term visions. And you will not find our traditional knowledge where you are now. You are found it only in the memory of our grandfather and the memory of our grandmothers. So our knowledge about nature is so big than Wikipedia, but it is not written in the books. It is transmitted orally from mother to daughter, from father to son. So that's why protecting this immaterial heritage is so important for the world. Because we all know the modern knowledge, if your computer died or if you are not with electricity, you can have your knowledge in the internet. We know how to find it in the library because you've written it in the book. But most of our indigenous people's traditional knowledge are immaterial. It is a communities who have the knowledge. And when like the communities in Amazon or in Asia or in Africa disappear, it is the equivalent of millions of books and 1,000 of knowledge. So that's why it is so important across the world to protect the indigenous people's traditional knowledge and then to value them through these conventions. But so now we are the most marginalized. We are receiving pressure from government, industry, destroying our land, destroying our natural resources. We have the greenhouse gases, who is more ever. The world is facing the most hot temperatures around the world. And for us, it is not about the numbers of the temperature. It is about losing our knowledge. Because when we lose a biodiversity species, it is losing our knowledge. And our knowledge are so rich because our environment are rich. So how we can all protect our traditional knowledge to protect the rest of the species of the world and to fight the climate change. Of course, in the recent years, we do have the important progress that recognize the indigenous people's traditional knowledge and valuing them. And then the Kunming biodiversity outcome show that the indigenous peoples are the most who are protecting the biodiversity. And we have the climate change conventions through the Paris Agreement who recognize the indigenous peoples. And I believe that with this convention and the role of UNESCO in the member state, it can become very practical and efficient to protect the cultural heritage of indigenous peoples. We need to do the inventory that can respect our intellectual property rights, because it is our knowledge who are there, the knowledge of our communities, safeguarding them and creating a safeguard for the intellectual property rights is very important for our knowledge. We need the methodology to collaborate as partners to protect and promote the indigenous people's traditional knowledge. For instance, I am doing the 3D or 2D participatory mapping that can help to combine the best knowledge from the technology and then the best, greatest knowledge of our communities. So how we can use and bridge the gap and safeguard our knowledge. So we also need to fulfill the respect of the indigenous people's rights to protect our land, territories, and resources. Because if our rights are not respected, our knowledge cannot be protected. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hindu. And I think, again, there's some very important ideas put out there. And one, and we heard this morning perhaps about having the different culture conventions working together and reinforcing each other. But I think here we also are hearing a cry perhaps for a role of the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage being maybe better integrated also with the biodiversity and climate agreements that are so critical to the world today. So there's an interesting idea, and thank you very much. And it brings us to our next also online panelist, who we're also very honored to have and would like to thank her for taking the time. Karima Benoune, who is the former Special Rapporteur for climate change, author of the report on culture, climate change, and cultural rights, and Special Rapporteur on cultural rights. Dr. Benoune, you're a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. You are known as a scholar and human rights expert and advocate. You served as the UN Special Rapporteur for Cultural Rights from 2015 to 2021 and contributed as an expert for the International Criminal Court during a case involving the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage sites in Mali. You have taught on a wide range of university courses, and your work has been published in many renowned journals. So again, I thank you for being with us. And I'd just like to ask, when you were a special rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, you prepared a fascinating and insightful report on climate change, culture, and cultural rights. So I was wondering if you could speak about the importance of cultural heritage and cultural rights in meeting the challenges of climate change. And what are your recommendations to implement cultural rights and safeguard living heritage in the face of the climate emergency?
Thank you very much for these questions, and greetings, annyeonghaseyo. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be in the great city of Seoul with you today, but I'm truly honored to participate virtually as a former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights who had the privilege of collaborating with UNESCO many times. I thank the organizers for putting this important event together to mark the 20th anniversary of the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, and for including me along with these distinguished fellow speakers. For me, it is nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was feeling tired, but I'm so energized by the remarks that we've already heard. So very happy to be staying awake with you. And we have to be wide awake in these times when we face the threat of the climate emergency. When I was the Special Rapporteur, I emphasized the protection of cultural heritage is also a human rights issue. And I took a holistic approach to heritage, trying to ensure that intangible heritage receives the full attention it so deserves. The specific topic of the role of cultural heritage in challenging climate change could not be more important in this moment, when in some places people can cook an egg on the sidewalk. It's so hot. Across the world, human beings are experiencing heat waves and other forms of extreme weather. And let's be clear, this is just a prelude to what we will face if we fail to take effective climate action. While we have to face up to the scale of the challenges, which are grave indeed, I also hope we will approach our subject matter with a spirit of urgent optimism, remembering the words of Berta Cáceres, the slain Honduran indigenous rights defender, who said, "Let us come together and remain hopeful as we defend and care for the blood of this earth and its spirit." I think of those words when I do this work and participate in these discussions. And I want to think about what it means to do what she asked us to do today in 2023, specifically by using cultural heritage. And I'm going to draw on my 2016 report to the General Assembly on heritage and human rights, as well as my 2020 report for the GA on cultural rights and climate change, which you can now find at the top of my Twitter feed at Karima Benoon. I wanted to make it easy to find if you'd like to take a look at the report. So urgent action on climate change is needed to protect the cultures and cultural rights of billions of people around the world, and to avoid what I called in my report the cultural extinction of the most vulnerable. As an official in Tuvalu asked me during my mission to his country, if we are not here anymore, what will happen to our culture? Imagine having to ask that question. The climate emergency is one of the greatest threats humanity has ever faced, and it is, I argue, the leading global threat to cultural rights, though there are, of course, others. This threat has to be effectively addressed now. The negative impacts of climate change on human cultures must be placed high on the international agenda. And this is equally true of the positive potential of our cultures, including our intangible heritage and the exercise of our cultural rights to serve as critical tools in our response to the climate emergency. What I argue is that we need a tripartite integration of environmental, cultural, and human rights perspectives on climate change in both policy and expertise. And we need to see the creation of channels of communication and cooperation between policymakers and civil society in all these three areas. Again, climate change and cultural heritage and human rights. What I'm arguing for the purposes of our topic tonight is that we need to understand and reimagine the 2003 convention as also being a resource for developing a cultural rights-based approach to climate change. And time is very short. I just want to emphasize two main points. The first is that we have to deal with the scale of the threat the climate emergency poses to cultures, and we've heard this from some of the previous speakers. We may lose nothing less than centuries of human cultural achievement, many of the cultural practices that people hold most dear, and even their entire ways of life. As I stressed in my 2020 report, holistic assessment of heritage impacts from climate change is essential. Not only tangible and natural heritage, but also the practice and transmission of a host of rich, intangible cultural heritage practices, from oral traditions to festive events to interactions and relationships with nature. All of these are at risk. And as I always said when I was the special rapporteur, tangible, intangible, and natural heritage are largely porous and overlapping categories, and human beings enjoy their related human rights really across them in a holistic way. So this means that the effects of climate change on cultural heritage also have to be assessed holistically. Losses reported in the intangible heritage area already include the ability to live on ancestral lands, the guardianship of sacred sites, folklore, traditional medicine, and cultural knowledge, including, as we've just heard so eloquently, indigenous knowledge and practice. Less documentation, monitoring, and analysis of intangible heritage impacts has been undertaken, and this is urgently needed. As ICOMOS stressed in its submission for my report on climate change and culture, identifying knowledge and belief systems at risk from climate change must become a priority. Popular engagement, citizen science, and appropriate use of traditional and indigenous knowledge in monitoring processes should be encouraged. The documentation for nominations to the lists of the 2003 convention is one potential source for understanding threats posed to ICH by climate change. The 2015 operational directives for the 2003 convention focus on fostering grassroots resilience to natural hazards and climate change. States are encouraged to fully integrate communities, groups, and individuals who are bearers of such knowledge into systems and programs of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I think we have to repeat this again and again. I hope that UNESCO and states parties to the convention will maximize the use of Criterion 5 from the operational guidelines for implementation of the World Heritage Convention concerning heritage that has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. And I understand some informal approaches to this question have been under discussion, and what I really hope is that those will continue and be formalized. We also have to remember that while the climate emergency threatens humanity in its entirety and all human cultures, I cannot stress enough that the impacts hit specific peoples and places disproportionately, posing particular threats to the cultures of populations living in the most vulnerable environments, such as small island developing states, as well as indigenous peoples, women, and youth. So we have to be committed to climate culture justice. And I repeat my call at the General Assembly for the international community to adopt a human rights-based global action plan to save the cultures of humanity and protect cultural rights from the climate emergency. Such a plan needs to fully incorporate intangible heritage. Finally, I want to say that even as they are under threat, cultural rights and cultural resources are powerful allies in the battle against climate change. They should be more fully integrated into climate action. Climate heritage and traditional knowledge are climate assets and should be recognized as such. Where relevant and appropriate human rights respecting traditional knowledge systems exist, every effort should be made to integrate these into heritage site disaster management plans. As the Seoul Vision document helpfully stresses, cultural heritage can help us benefit from lessons learned in the past about coping with environmental changes and about the integration of nature and culture. And they can promote an ethic of stewardship and reuse that we need so much now. I'm delighted to note that efforts to mainstream culture and heritage into climate action have led to a campaign to get a joint work decision adopted at COP28. This would start a one-year consultation by the UNFCCC that would hopefully result at COP29 in the adoption of a work program on culture-based climate action. We all need to support efforts to make this happen and to fully integrate intangible heritage and the 2003 convention in this work. And I can think of no better outcome of our celebration of this 20th anniversary than if we see this endeavor succeed. Let me conclude by saying that we know that cultures and cultural rights have inherent value, but we also must now recognize their tremendous utility in our existential fight against climate change. This means that we have yet one more reason to protect cultural heritage and ensure cultural rights. Without them, we are at even greater risk in our warming world. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Benoon, and also for staying up late and participating with us on this important topic. And thank you also for bringing in also the crucial human rights pillar of what we're discussing, but also finishing on that hopeful note that we have this instrument that can help us mobilize these resources once we acknowledge them first and move with them. So this will now, so thank you for that, and we'll come now to our next panelist. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Kyung-Koo Han. So I will call you Kyung-Koo, if that's okay. You are the Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and you've taught anthropology at Kangwon National University, and served as the Dean at Kookmin University, as well as at Seoul National University. You were a member of the Policy Planning Committee of the Korea Federation for the Environmental Movement, as well as the Presidential Commission for Sustainable Development. So now I'm going to ask you a question in your capacity as Secretary General of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, and ask you what kind of synergies you might see between the 2003 convention and other programs in relation to themes around biodiversity and climate change.
예, 유네스코에서 아주 중요한 질문을 주셨습니다. 좋은 문제 제기에
Thank you very much for the very good question, and thank you for raising this very important topic. I understand that recently there have been a lot of emphasis on multi-sectoral and transversal approach on the parts of UNESCO. I believe that this is very encouraging, that we're seeing a lot of these multi-sectoral approaches at UNESCO. And education, heritage education, there's a lot of emphasis on sustainable developments and climate change. And even in global citizen education, there's also a lot of emphasis placed on World Heritage and ICH, as well as cultural diversity and sustainable developments and climate change. In UNESCO, there are very excellent scientific programs having to do with biodiversity and climate change. However, there is a lack of synergy effect tied in with ICH programs. So I think it's very important for us to find the synergy together with science-themed programs, because we understand that a lot of ICH, while it is cultural heritage passed down by humans, a lot of them have to do with nature. So I do think that we need to find those synergy effects with science programs. So for example, there are 5 that I would like to talk about. There is the Intergovernmental Hydrological Program, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. These are 2 very ancient commissions, both passed in 1960s. The programs have been expanded over the years, and there is a lot of emphasis on sustainable development to respond to the demand of the times. I believe that these tie in with SDG goal number 6 and goal number 14, having to do with water and marine life. These are really having to do with natural and scientific research programs. And recently there were the Global Geoparks program, very recent in 2015. So this has to do with science and culture as well, and science and nature. And there is the Man and Biosphere, the MAB program, which was created in the 70s. And there is this emphasis on man there, on humans. So this has to do with the relationship between humans and nature. So there is a high emphasis with this relationship to ICH. I believe that there's also, with World Heritage, there's these various programs like geologic parks, which are majestic, huge in scale. And these have to do with the majesty of nature. We feel that we are so small and humble when we stand in the face of this majesty of nature. Mother Nature creating wind and rain and thunder and lightning and clouds. For a long time, we have worshipped the forces of nature. Nature has been so large and unpredictable, but they've always been ever present. We were powerless in the face of nature. And if we tried to bring some changes to nature, they would always come back. We have tried to look at nature in that way. We have tried to make use of nature and understand nature. And when we look at ICH practices, they have either tried to make use of nature or tried to use the forces of nature. But in the past, we thought that nature is all-powerful and that it will always be there. But no longer can we expect that to be true. Because right now, after the industrial revolutions, with the accelerated progress made in science and technology and in our industry, we're now maintaining a very shaky balance with nature, because the nature that we have known has changed, and there is this risk that it can be completely, fundamentally changed in an instant. So this means that if we look at the science programs of UNESCO, yes, nature can be majestic. However, the science programs of UNESCO continue to stress only that point, the majesty of nature. The ICH programs many of them have to do with nature. Many of them have to do with the changes in the seasons, in nature. And we understand that climate change is threatening the very origin and the foundation of ICH. Climate change has also brought about changes in the animal life, the flora and fauna, the seasons, and the weathers that are very closely tied in with living heritage, such as our practices of farming, agriculture, of growing crops, rituals. Many of them have become impossible to continue to have because of climate change. we understand that ultimately, if we look at ICH, there is that hope contained within for a stable climate and a sustainability in animal and flora resources. We understand that climate change has brought about serious threats. Of course, the international community has tried to safeguard much of our cultural resources through the 2003 convention, but climate change has rendered much of this very difficult to safeguard. If these have been murdered in the past, in the future, they might come under the situation of genocide. So we must respond to the serious threats of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. To do that, we must look into ourselves and try to find ways of coexistence where humans and nature and culture can all coexist together. And I do think that ICH can provide a solution to that, which is why the ICH Convention and UNESCO's other programs should be integrated together to try to create more synergy effects. And to that end, I would like to make 3 proposals. The first is that UNESCO's science-themed programs should have a more active cultural perspective. I am the Secretary General of the National Career Commission of UNESCO, and also as a cultural anthropologist, I would say that there is a lot of these excellent UNESCO science programs in oceanography and hydrology, but I don't think there is enough of a cultural perspective there. I do think that there needs to be more of a cultural perspective in these science programs. And secondly, I propose that we can include the perspective of ICH, intangible cultural heritage, in the programs having to do with natural rights and the rights of humans. Unlike the MAB program, which incorporates the word man, I do think that it's still focusing on nature and ecosystem. So with these biospheres, we have to increase people's awareness on living heritage as well. So these are some of the areas that I would like to propose. And lastly, I think that we need to I would like to make a proposal on the 2003 Convention inscription process, which is a very important process to raise awareness on the important values of UNESCO. I think that perhaps we can prioritize those ICH elements that are particularly closely tied in with biodiversity and response to climate change. There may be many member countries that have excellent heritage elements but might not have enough experience in inscription process, so perhaps we can provide workshops maybe once a year on them. I think that this capacity building international workshop by the National Commission of UNESCO for Korea could be a good benchmark model. These are the proposals that I would like to make, and I hope that we can identify further synergies between these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Han. I think lots of fascinating ideas there as well on how to synergize. It's a theme that's coming through, I think, from all our panelists so far, that we must think of this convention within the broader framework of issues going on, and particularly in the environmental issues, and how can we position it to engage much more strongly, perhaps, with some of those other processes, including in UNESCO, but also we heard before, beyond. So now it's a pleasure to introduce the next and final panelist. I call her Gulnara because we know each other, but it's Dr. Ait Paiva, who has been very active in the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. You're a researcher and the director of the Aygin Cultural Research Center, which is an accredited NGO under the 2003 convention. You also represented Kyrgyzstan in the Intergovernmental Committee on ICH from 2012 to 2016, and served as an expert in its subsidiary body from 2013 and 2015, and you now have returned for a second mandate in the evaluation body last year. Your research focuses on lesser-known aspects of Kyrgyzstan's cultural and natural heritage, integrating folk and scholarly epistemologies. And you've done extensive research on sacred natural sites. So my question to you would be, how can these sacred natural sites, or these sacred sites, foster the human relationship to nature and contribute to biodiversity conservation and its sustainable use? And in particular, how does the ICH safeguarding play in that relationship?
very much, team, for introducing me. And I would like to greet all of you. Good afternoon. First of all, I am very honored and moved to be among you, stakeholders of ICH. And the Republic of Korea is absolutely impressive country to be. And thank you for the country and its representatives. Let me answer on the questions from team based on the Kyrgyz case of the sacred sites. But I would like to mention that during last several years, several nomination files from different countries dedicated to sacred sites or practices associated with sacred sites were successfully inscribed in different lists of UNESCO. So Kyrgyz case somehow reflects an international experience. When this convention started its life, our organization started researching sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan, and at that time we did know nothing about the convention. With custodians and communities, we identified and described more than 100 sites which are located around the country. I have the map, but probably it could not come. What is important about these sites? All of them encompass a wide array of natural elements, such as springs, mountains, caves, trees, lakes, and stones. While some sites are man-made structures, like monuments or graveyards, they blend into the natural environment. According to one of the folk classifications which we found in one of the remote regions, vast majority of the sacred site belong to the Jer-Su, or sites of land and water. In other words, all of these sites have spiritual guardians like birds, trees, animals. One of the old healers, which we used to work together for many years, used to express the formula: a white candle for the white side and a blue candle for a blue side. She learned this formula from her masters, and this formula keeps and transmits the ancient knowledge about the individuality and significance of each site. The idea of diversity, including biodiversity, is deeply embedded in the very nature of sacred sites. In 2008-2010, we conducted a large research on 6 sacred sites in a particular smaller province. And the findings of this research revealed that a notable difference between the biodiversity of the sacred sites themselves and the surrounding areas. It is essential to emphasize that biodiversity is not an isolated concept among Kyrgyz traditional communities. It is rather an integral part of a larger cultural paradigm. It is interwoven within the fabric of cultural beliefs and practices. These beliefs and practices are based on the philosophy of reciprocity. This site provides safety and well-being, and humans in turn must care for and protect it. This belief is mutual care, nurtures and safeguards the flora and fauna of sacred sites. Kyrgyz people take care about biodiversity through diverse rituals, nurturing their bond with the natural environment. During our research observations around the sacred lakes in the remote south region, we witnessed a remarkable folk protection mechanism known as Bata, blessing ritual. This ritual was specifically aimed at banning fishing in the Kulun River. The Bata ritual exemplifies a successful local approach that delivers visible results in the short time, in 3 years, without the need for substantial resources. To address the question of why human-nature relations are crucial in facing today's challenges and how living heritage can strengthen these connections, it is insightful to look back at the restoration of the sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan. The massive restoration of sacred sites in our country took place in 1990-2000 years, in the first decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The collapse of Soviet Union was an unexpected, terrible disaster for most of its citizens, including Kyrgyz people. In this time of total uncertainty and then drastic redesign of social space, people needed hope and belief in miracles. Sacred sites emerged as places where faith were rekindled and hope finds support. In the face of disintegrating customary relations, nature and ancestors who became a part of nature, they offered vital support to the indigenous ethnic groups of the newly independent country. The natural sacred sites provided strength and grassrooted resilience. I use this recent history to show how human-nature relations rooted in living heritage have played a pivotal role in supporting and empowering individuals, communities in Kyrgyzstan, even participated in nation-building process. The sacred sites form a significant part of the country's physical map, reflecting the interweaving of ideas, knowledge, and practices that extend beyond their physical presence. There is a big sacred site, Atabeyid, the grave of fathers, near the capital of the country in Bishkek. At Atabeyid, there are words above the arch, the white bends but doesn't break. This traditional philosophy of Kyrgyz people work for the entire sacred space. The concept of ak in Kyrgyz language or white in Kyrgyz language is always positive and broad. The words, the notions of transparency and justice have the same root of white. The sacred geography is as a form of communal self-organization and mobilization emerged during Kyrgyzstan's nation-building process. It reflects a strategy of survival, self-identification, and safety rooted in traditional beliefs. Living heritage represented by sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan offers an important insight into the importance of human-nature relations. The sacred geography's principles of justice, mutual responsibility, and interconnection resonate deeply with the people, serving as a guide force to address today's challenges and create a more sustainable future. Now, Convention 2003 is becoming even more important tool for local people like Kyrgyz because it is a document helping to protect all of our heritage in front of the global and other challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gulnara, for, I think, fascinating insight to not only the human-nature relationship and the importance of these sacred sites in Kyrgyzstan, but also how the role it played in what you described, major historical and political changes and turmoil. So we see this other dimension of the living heritage, very important for people's well-being and continuity. We're a little bit behind time, but we started a little bit late. So I would, especially for those of you who are online with us late at night, I would like to give the opportunity to the audience to ask maybe 2 questions, maybe 3 if anybody has any questions. If anybody would like to ask any of our panelists any questions, I can take 1 or 2 and we'll ask them to answer very briefly. I'm not sure. If I don't see questions, I might go for some just final wrap-up words from the various panelists. Do I see? I have 1 hand here. Okay, I see. Could you please introduce yourself when you ask your question? And please, if your question is directed to a specific panelist, please state so.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question again. So my name is Janet Blake. I'm Associate Professor of Human Rights Law at Shahid Beheshti University in Tehran. And I would like to address my question particularly to Professor Karima Benounev. It relates to this issue of the synergy between not just different treaties, but actually different areas of international law, and whether you think that the World Heritage Convention, with 195 states parties, has or could be used more by the international community to exercise obligations to protect the climate, as much as including intangible cultural heritage and heritage more generally within the Climate Change Convention, but whether we should also be thinking about how the World Heritage Convention particularly can help us to protect the climate. Thank you.
I think, sorry, do we have our panelists? Oh, please, yeah, if you could. It's a rather, we are tight for time, so I'll ask you to answer in a minute or two, if you could. I know it's a very profound question. Please, Professor Benoon.
Thank you very much for this important question, and I hope we can have an ongoing conversation about this. I think we have to look for every resource that we can, and we have to think holistically across international law, both in the area of cultural heritage protection, also in the area of cultural rights protection and the human rights treaties. And I think this is why I suggested the particular sort of possibility of using that criterion 5 related to the World Heritage Convention. I think that that is an avenue that needs to be more fully explored. And I would say also in the human rights area, I don't think that we've done enough in terms of reminding states that they actually have legal obligations to protect culture and cultural rights, and the human right to have access to and to enjoy cultural heritage, including the heritage of others. So again, I think this speaks to this integration, bringing together the heritage standards that we have, the environmental standards that we have, and the human rights standards that we have, and using them in an intersectional way. And there's much more that could be said, but I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Since I don't see any more questions, perhaps would any panelists, Hindu, would you like to make any last remark? I think maybe Hindu's frozen.
Yeah, thank you so much, team. Just I wanted to say that we cannot talk about protecting cultural heritage without protecting the rights of indigenous communities. So our rights to our land, to our territories, to our resources are most important to protect our culture, our identity, and our traditional knowledge. And that need to be into the recognitions of these conventions within the climate change negotiations and within also the biodiversity negotiation. They cannot tackle them in silo without just connecting it to these conventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you again for being with us. Ralph, Minister Regan-Vanu, I'm not sure if the connection is still good. If not, perhaps Dr. Han, you'd like to say some last?
I think that I was overly critical of the UNESCO science programs, but I should say that when we talk about education or culture, there's a lot of synergy that is existing between the two. There are many best practices that we can look to, and particularly in the last General Assembly, the Education for the Future report, if we look at that, we see that education is something that a whole of society approach is needed, and lifelong learning and higher education. There's a lot of mention about these topics, and I think that they all are tied in with the ICH convention, and there's possibility for a lot of synergy effect between the two. And even within culture, there's a creative cities network, for example, which I do think that can also maximize the potential of a synergy between the two. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, team. Synergy and holistic approaches do exist in many traditional systems, and probably the further development of convention could be done taking into account these systems. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. I think I want to try to go over everything that was said. I think we got some very strong messages very clearly from different parts of the world, that the importance of living heritage in facing many of these crises we're facing: the climate change, the loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation, and in particular for certain populations, but also in a more generic way as a way of reshaping a relationship to the natural world. We also heard a lot of call for more integration with the various instruments and various other programs going on. And I think this is something that the convention will have to keep working on, maybe beyond also the other cultural conventions, but really getting into some of the environmental conventions, environmental-related conventions and programs. So with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists sorry, Professor Benoon, you answered a question. Do you want to have a quick wrap-up word as well, or do you feel?
I would just very quickly say, please take a look at my report from 2020. I think that I answered Professor Blake's question in a more thorough way in that report. But also, let's think about how we can interpret the heritage conventions, taking human rights into consideration. We don't do that often enough. The human rights piece disappears out of the discussion. And I think it's critical to reminding people why heritage is so important, that we can't enjoy a wide range of our human rights, whether it's freedom of religion, whether it's economic rights of people related who work in the heritage and tourism sectors, without the protection of heritage. So let's keep the human rights lens focused on this issue. And thanks so much for listening, and I hope I'm making sense at 1:30 in the morning.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Yes, I think it makes a lot of sense, and we've also seen a clear sort of convergence between these natural issues, human rights, and of course cultural rights and intangible cultural heritage being mentioned, I think, across all panelists. With that, I think we can end this panel. Once again, I'd really like to thank all the panelists for your participation, and I believe we'll move to the next panel. And we will capture many of these ideas, I think, in the final version of the Seoul vision, which will help guide the convention in the years to come. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much. ICH can connect humans to nature and also contribute to the restoration of communities, and we can make effective use of ICH to try to bring about social change for the future of the planet. With that, we'll take a short coffee break. The Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation is hosting an exhibit in the lobby, and also there's a new technology-inspired exhibition that is fostered by a Korean Science and Technology Foundation that we invite you to take a look at. Please enjoy the coffee break, and after that, we'd like to have today's last session, the Living Heritage and Quality Education. Thank you.
We would like to begin session 3.
네, 잠시 휴식 시간은
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your short coffee break. There were some technical issues due to the connection problem. I'd like to ask for your understanding. I would also like to thank you all for staying here until the very end of today's program. Now let us begin the third session on living heritage and quality education. In this session, there will be Ms. Susan Schnuknen, Chief of Unit of Capacity Building of UNESCO Living Heritage Entity as a moderator, as well as Ms. Adriana Molamo, Ms. Heila Rodziska, Mr. Yao Idu, Mr. Badri Bahaduru, as well as Mr. Samir Adar. So we have 3 panel members joining us on site and 2 panel members are joining us online. So we will have a panel discussion with these 5 panel members. Please welcome them with a big round of applause.
Ms. Susan, you may have the floor. You may have the floor.
Thank you very much. And hello, good afternoon, good morning to those who are connected. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this session on living heritage and quality education. You already kindly presented us. My name is Susanne Schnutgen and I am from UNESCO. So the topic of today's session is living heritage and quality education. And we want to look at the connections of these 2 fields, living heritage safeguarding on the one hand and education on the other. And we want to understand why this connection is so important. And why it is so important, particularly today, because, I don't know if you're aware, but UNESCO published a report on the futures of education. And in fact, they observed that really we have a learning crisis. Education systems around the world are not able anymore to meet the expectations of the learners, of the families, of the parents. What is wrong? What is happening? And what can living heritage actually contribute to address this learning crisis? This is the topic that our distinguished panelists are going to talk about today. I would like to quickly see, though, I think we're having the film before we connect the other panelists, sorry. Then let me just frame a little more our conversation. So we have the learning crisis, and UNESCO has started a couple of years ago a new program, an intersectoral program on living heritage and education, because we saw a strategic advantage for both, for the education sector and for the culture sector. For culture, integrating living heritage and education allows us to have a broader social approach to safeguarding. And from the perspective of education, it can help to increase the relevance of education. Relevance is a concept that is very important these days, and to help attain the sustainable development goals that Ban Ki-moon has talked about a lot this morning, and there's the number 4 on quality education and lifelong learning. So it's related with education for citizenship, sustainable development, appreciation of cultural diversity, the role of understanding the role of culture and development, and promoting mutual understanding and peace. So what can this connection between living heritage and education bring to these larger issues of this learning crisis? Yes, I think we can start with a little film like we did in the other sessions. we have a young facilitator from Ghana, no, from the Gambia, sorry, if I'm not mistaken. So, no, sorry, this is now the film, and then you go, yes. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Rohi El-Sisi, an ICH support facilitator in the Gambia. Safeguarding ICH intangible cultural heritage is important to me because it is my identity. It will enable the younger generation to have an idea of their culture and heritage. One ICH element in my community I will love to discuss are traditional songs or indigenous songs. They are locally called Ngansin Denkiloli. These are songs that are meant to be sung on traditional events like wedding ceremonies, initiative ceremony, which is the passage of right to manhood. Each and every one of these songs have a connotative meaning. They meant something. The elderly people sang these songs to the younger ones so that they can teach them about societal norms, values, and ethics. Tambaude faran tambaude. Tambaude faran tambaude. These are songs for traditional gifts when they were receiving the colonial flag at Tendabang. So each and every one of these songs have a connotative meaning. They meant something. One challenge of this ICH element is not being practiced by the younger generation. But I'm very sure if they are integrated in both our formal and non-formal education system, it is going to be very useful. When they are integrated in our formal education system, it is going to make sure that the living heritage does not die. The young people at school will have the access to learn about their societal norms, values, and ethics, and promote peaceful coexistence among them for the element to be safeguarded. When it comes to our non-formal education system, the community themselves, they are the experts. They know better about ICH. So when they have the chance to workshop, seminars, and awareness creation on how to safeguard their intangible cultural heritage, it is going to play a major role ladder in ICH safeguarding. Because ICH, our intangible cultural heritage, they are not taught in schools. We don't have the chance to learn them in our schools. And as a child in the Gambia, and I believe every other child in the world will be very glad to see that we learn about our culture, because if we do not know about our culture today, it will be hard for us to know where we are going, because if you don't know where you are coming from, your destination tomorrow will be somehow, because our reality, our identity is our culture. So we will want it to be integrated in our education system so that we can have access to learn about them, because right now they are not taught in our schools. One thing that worries me about ICH safeguarding is the issue of globalization. My question to the world leaders is, what are the current plans that you have at hand to make sure that our ICH elements are being integrated in our schools to promote quality education?
Wow, that's a powerful speech and a big question. Yes, applause. Applause for Rohi Sisai, who is surely connected from the Gambia. This was a lovely video to set the tone of this particular panel. Could we now please also put online, see who is online. There is actually our colleague Ido Yao. So he's the director of the International Bureau for Education. Hello, Ido, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you properly.
Great.
Good morning, everyone.
Good. And then here to my left, we have Professor Hela Lotz from South Africa. Can you also hear us, Hela?
Yes, good morning, Susan. Good morning, colleagues. I can hear.
Great, great. I just wanted to check that you're well connected. Okay. We would like, though, to start with our speaker from Nepal, Mr. Badri Bahadur Tamang. Mr. Badri Bahadur Tamang, you are a teacher at the Mahendra Secondary School, which is a public school in Nepal, and you have over a decade of experience in teaching at different schools and colleges. And a little while ago, while you were English teacher at the Ganesh Secondary School, you became a team leader for a UNESCO project, teaching with intangible cultural heritage in schools in Asia and the Pacific. Could you tell us about the experience of implementing this UNESCO project, about the process and the impact it had on the students of your schools? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan. Nice to see you in person, although we had some online talks before. And I would like to, before I begin, I would like to thank UNESCO and the Korean government for creating such an context where the people around the world have come here and talked the very important issue here. And quality education, and here, before, what I'll be doing here is I'll be putting my focus on three major issues today as I'm asked a question. And for that, like, you know, I was one of the implementer, I would say the ICS practitioner of the UNESCO pilot project in Nepal. And so I'll be telling here why ICS in education is important. And I'll be also putting my focus on the process that we did, and finally the impacts that we had from the pilot project. So before I begin, I would like to again put the light on the learning crisis of the UNESCO report. Why learning crisis? That's a question. So as a teacher, the question is very, very important, and that directly goes to my heart. And I think learning crisis is there. And from this project, what I learned, what I experienced is one of the reason of the learning crisis may be the gap, the disconnect between the family and the school. So I'm talking in context of formal education. So in terms of formal education, most of what we understand is, learning happens only in the classroom, in a formal setting. And ICSE education, when this project was implemented in Nepal, it entirely changed my way of thinking. Oh, it's not just the learning in the classroom. So the classroom rules, classroom walls, maybe the dress codes, maybe the discipline codes, I think they are the barriers for the learning. So ICSE in education is such a project that could bring, that could take the students, not remaining all the four walls of the classroom, but taking outside. So I think that is one of the best thing I learned, because as a learners, they learn also at home, and they learn also in the classroom. But the things of the homes are not brought in the classroom, and that kind of gap is there. So ICSE in education of the UNESCO project was exactly to bridge the gap, that gap. And when we talk, and then learning crisis, and today's topic is very important, quality education, learning crisis, again connected to the ICSE in education. Then if we have to solve the problem of learning crisis, then for me, I think we have to take ICSE in education in the classroom. I think ICSE in education has to be taken in the classroom, because we have been talking about global citizenship, education. We have been to create the younger people to make the global citizen, so that they can build the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that they need to make the peaceful world. And again, it is connected with education for sustainable development. We are talking about social sustainability, and I found ICSE dealing with social practices, rituals, different events, different local pedagogical approaches, I think so, and also environmental sustainability, because ICSE will put focus on local approaches to conserve the biodiversity, and also local strategies to reduce the risk, especially the natural disasters. And again, I think for economic sustainability, in terms of traditional ways of life, we deal about traditional ways of life. We talk about craft making and traditional ways of agriculture, and also for the local products, we put much focus on local products, activities. And again, these days, we have found learners more aggressive and being more indifferent. So for that, we might need social, emotional learning. And I think taking ICSE in the classroom has been so important for this. And another most important thing I would like to put up on is the mother tongue education. And when we implemented that project in Nepal, especially we gave space for the local language. Our learners from whenever they get opportunity to opportunity to foster their local language, then we found them being very proactive and very active. And so I'll be putting much focus later on it with the impacts. And now let me talk about the process. So for this process, it was implemented in Nepal in two very, very important municipalities, one in the northern side and one in the southern side of Nepal, of Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal. And it benefited 473 students were involved, 13 teachers, 3 community members, 5 school management committee members, and 2 education officers. And first of all, different multi-stakeholders were there to talk about how to implement. And from our municipality, 2 schools were selected. I was, Ganesh Secondary School is one of them, and I was from there, and I would like to remember my principal, Mim Kaji Shrestha over here, who just made me the team leader to lead the schools. And in this project, I was also very anxious, ICS thing is something like in social studies or culture. How does it happen in mathematics? How does it happen in English or some other subject? I was very wondering in the beginning, but when we came into practice, different 3 teachers. I was one from English teacher, one mathematics teacher, one social teacher, and 1 community members, and 1 head teacher, of course, the school admin team, and 1 expert from the community. We were 5 in the team. And it was launched, and there was 1 NGO for helping us, and UNESCO observer was always there in every phases of learning and teaching. And then, how we did, first of all, we're given a training, we're given a workshop, orientation, right after the orientation, and then we have got to go for the framework. A framework was of a planning. Was something like, first of all, we were supposed to find the ICS environment, finding the context, and then connecting the context with the living heritage, with the school curriculum again, and learning about the selected ICS, and then we have got to design a lesson plan, we have to execute it, and finally we have to share our reflection on that. And one of the best things that I found for that is, it was, as a teacher, it was a COVID-19 situation. One of the challenges was that. And although we were not able to face-to-face, then there were lots of online sessions. We interacted and discussions. And finally, we even dared to come together in face-to-face and did this project successful. And for that, one of the best things that I found over there was, when I make a lesson plan, I used to make alone. But when we made lesson plan for ICS, then my core teachers were there, different subject teachers, we sat together, and then we were community members, we were experts with us for making plans. Of course, we had the learners and the school admin team, because we might need some budgeting and management, everything else. So cooperation was there. And then, we did. And we selected one of the, for my school, I'm so thank you, because, in a head cover, this is the, in a head cover, if you have this one, okay, this is from my school. I'm so happy, and here we had the Nipuna Shrestha ma'am from UNESCO Kathmandu. I would like to remember her and thank her for covering, and I would like to thank UNESCO for covering our story. And here, what happened is, we used to make plans and student first. We were encouraged to put a student first, and then we made up plans. And to execute the plans, what we did is our learners, the students, they were directly involved in learning, teaching. For example, in my locality here, like Tamang culture, Tamang community, one of the indigenous community there, and we found the ICS Lochar. Lochar is one of the celebration celebrated by that community. That's been New Year. And in that New Year, there's one special food eaten, kapse, and we connected it with maths, English, and science. Now the question is how we connected with social studies. Of course, they had the social costumes, they had the festivals, celebrations, especially we connected in curriculum with dresses, and the dance, the folk dance that they do. And with English, like, oh, okay, then the students went to the community. We gave certain questions, research questions. They went there, they talked with the community members, they collected the informations, and they made a, they made a kind of text and related to, and then recipe writing. There was a question, recipe writing, that Khapse, we connected with that writing skill. And then finally, with mathematics, different shapes and sizes and the different materials that they need. And finally, what was the, we made a kind of exhibition there. In the exhibition, we made up plans, and what were the impacts then? It gave us a better impacts on different stakeholders. We invited them. The students directly made the food there. All of the participants, they tested. And then finally, from this, what the conclusion that we drew was the classroom walls, of course, and the dress codes are the barriers for learning. We have to take students were so curious, and they collaborate each other. The so-called 21st century learning skills, the communication, collaboration, and the creative and critical thinking was there. They have high self-confidence. And the dropout rates, when in the classroom, they're very rare, and dropout rates were very lower.
That is really a big achievement, no?
Yes.
So it meant you managed to keep them in the classroom. We would love to almost take a course, I think, on how you did this. Are in the question answer question. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Badri Bahadur Tamang, because I think you gave us, right from the start, a very concrete example of what this means, bringing living heritage and education closer together and what it can do. Thank you so much. I would now like to turn from Asia to Latin America. We have Her Excellency, Miss Adriana Molano. Rebonjour, Adriana. Oui, je crois que ça marche automatiquement, en fait. So you are the Vice Minister of Regional Development and Heritage in the Ministry of Culture in Colombia. At the same time, you are a respected and well-known anthropologist and one of the leading experts in intangible cultural heritage in Latin America. You have led many, many projects on participatory cultural policy aimed at strengthening the social fabric of Afro-descendants, indigenous and peasant communities from a heritage perspective. You also served as Director General of CRESPIAL, which is the regional center for the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage of Latin America from 2017 to 2020. And there you developed and you actually designed a tailored capacity building strategy for the region for safeguarding living heritage. Adriana, can you elaborate on how linking or articulating living heritage and education, how it can contribute to peace? I think this is an area you have been focusing on a lot in your work on education and living heritage, and we would love to hear more about it. What are the opportunities and current challenges in articulating living heritage and education with the objective of building peace? You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Susan.
Thank you very much, Susan. I will speak Spanish because that's my mother language. I'll give you some time to listen to the translation. First of all, thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to find my family and friends from UNESCO. And thank you also to the government in Korea. I'm going to present the subject in three different points. First of all, I would like to speak a little bit about what is a culture of peace for us. Second, what is the relationship between the live patrimony and a culture of peace? And third, how we implement that into the education area. A terrain of culture on peace. This is something that we are elaborating, and we start by thinking about three type of violence. The first one is the violence of guns. We are unable to resolve a conflict, and then we move into the using guns. The second is the violence that is produced by inequalities. And this is the biggest one in Latin America and the world. We are not maybe able to see how inequalities produce a big level of inequalities, sometimes against women, against races, different races, against different social type. And third one is the cultural violence. And I don't think we are quite aware about how this violence impacts some countries like Colombia, Mexico, Chile, the narco traffic violence that has created in our young ones very violent ways. And that had created a question in us, the people from the immaterial patrimony, and how we can look for a peace culture. We are talking about reconciliation here. In some countries like Colombia, we have to speak about imperfect peace because we cannot achieve peace if we cannot resolve these conflicts and violences. We have had during the last 20 years several peace agreements, and we are still struggling, trying to achieve peace. Regarding this peace, this gun peace, ex-soldiers would talk to us about disarm hurts, and this is not a cliche phrase. When you leave the phrase, you need then to find yourself, you yourself as a person, how to become a member of the society. You need to disarm your heart, and that for that the patrimony, the intangible patrimony, is essential because it is associated with spirituality. And this talks to the human being and the social being. It is very important to construct a new notion for people and communities. Facing this violence that inequality creates, we need to work towards these policies that are created by governments. And in that aspect, the intangible patrimony also has a main factor to play here because it talks about diversity. And regarding the cultural violence, we're talking about the concept of cultural justice. Since from our point of view, this has a lot to do with human rights. How do we find a path to understand and value the immaterial, intangible patrimony that the other person right next to me possesses? We have seen on the field how the help of this, of keeping this intangible patrimony alive, is a key for resilience. There was a process, peace process a few years ago, 7 years ago. We were thinking at that time that we would achieve peace there was a disarm process. 15,000 guerrilla members would disarm themselves. We had some areas where they would leave their arms and they would go into some communities who used to be their victims in the past. This was like a social lab for us. And we understood at that very moment that the intangible patrimony can be of the utmost importance to create reconciliation among peoples. This is how we created a very clear relationship between the members of these societies. And nowadays, this area is well known in Colombia because they have achieved peace between the former guerrilla members who would terrify the very area they are now living on. We have sometimes a better understanding of what intangible material is, maybe sometimes better than even the government. I have another example about that, and this is about a massacre. I believe this was 30 people in African, South American community. In the outskirts of Colombia, these rituals from the Afro-South American communities were forbidden. And these, there used to have rituals for funerary rites, and they would sing, and these sing were forbidden. And these very songs were forbidden. And this was terrible for these communities because this was the way they communicate with their ancestors. After these massacres, communities decided that the way they had to heal and the way they have to activate their own patrimony was to restart to sing this song. And they have reactivated this practice that is helping them heal. Another example I have is about the cultural reparation. The very tissue that was broken by the armed conflict or another kind of violence. In this case, we're talking about colonization. This is about an example we have experienced. And this was the return of some mask that the German government has returned to the Colombian government, the mask of Kogis from Santa Marta, which the government of Germany has decided to return. This mask has been spiritually cleansed, and they had also been reactivated through rituals in order to conserve. And they are very important, these masks, because they are used to conserve the nature. These very rituals have allowed this community to reactivate their relationship with nature. And the Colombian government has decided to leave these masks with the very people that they used to own them. This shows how the traditional knowledge from Aboriginal people are as important as our Occidental knowledge. And finally, a very important subject between the immaterial, intangible patrimony and the construction of peace is the government of the communities. Most of all, how do we bring to the forefront the voice of the communities, how they can express themselves regarding their economy and their culture, and how do we mix this with the education. I agree with my colleague here. We have been living in a crisis, a continuing, ongoing crisis for the last 100 years. And this shows us that we have a hard time integrating these concepts into the education. And this is the question I am asking myself. How do we face these violences? How we construct this piece? So do I still have time? Oh, I have an example. The integral being and the reduction of the inequalities on the educative and the school system. As we say, that we have the informal and formal education, different categories. In these war zones, we have made some experience. Some of them are the most difficult areas of the country, like the Urabá, Antioqueño, and Urabá, Chowayo. In these areas, since the peace has arrived, we have created new schools where we bring theater plays and ballet plays where they discuss about these conflicts and we reflect about those very conflicts and this need to understand that this is not something that should happen again. These schools work about gender, they work with ecology and how this is going to define the territorial definition of these territories. And also the possibility of developing our areas, like instance in Mexico, the center of the Totonacas, where they have created their own school and their centers of transmissions. But we know that this is not possible everywhere in Latin America. Sometimes communities are not ready to do that. I want to talk about two other examples. One in Crespial.
I think we're running out of time, though it's fascinating to listen to you.
One, this was a work done with technologies in rural and urban areas. We wanted to bring the children to connect with the intangible patrimony. One of the first things we could understood it was that the parents did not like their children to work into with the intangible patrimony. This tells us about how strong is the colonialism in the area. I will go into the conclusions then. So the diversity is helping the education.
And its territories and it's a culture of peace. It encourages learning and identity to be done through the contextualized processes. For the education, we need to consider the different social agreements into pedagogy and encourage these practices of restoring it. Culture, learning, culture presence in the learning is so important. That's why culture and heritage should be implicated in education. when we learn through a masterpiece or a piece or an art, is better. It is something that should be included in the education system. Is an example of it. So there was a Truth Commission, and by law, it needs to be taken into education. What several schools have done is to extract the victims and generate processes with young persons, create theater pieces with these memories, and this is my last point.
Thank you very, very much, Her Excellency, Miss Adriana Molano. I think you really took us into a deep reflection on what the crisis really is and the seriousness of some of the issues we're facing. But at the same time, like we had in the previous panel, the notion of hope. I think what you shared gives also a lot of hope, because you have seen experiences where the power of intangible cultural heritage actually could help healing. And so it is a tool also for peace building as a learning process, maybe lifelong learning process, where intangible cultural heritage provides a space of learning in itself. So it's not only in bringing it into the institutions, but it's actually providing, ensuring that it can be transmitted to future generations so that the learning can happen. That happens through this, through the different intangible cultural heritage practices. And I think also you talked indirectly about the need for a diversity of approaches. You said that Tucanana, it's for some, it was possible in Colombia, it may not be possible in other places, but we need diverse responses, probably diversity of approaches, you know, to be able to support or to strengthen this linkage between intangible cultural heritage and education. But let me now turn to Africa, and there is Hela Lotz Zizitska, who is the Distinguished Research Professor at Rhodes University. You hold a chair in Global Change and Social Learning Systems at the Environmental Learning Research Center of Rhodes University, which you have directed for 15 years. You have contributed to many research and policy processes and programs, and you focus in particular on transformative learning and sustainability. With this work, you also collaborated quite a lot with UNESCO. You have done substantial research and project work on integrating living heritage in education, training educators, working with teacher training institutions and teachers. So Hela, what do you see as the major strengths and advantages of integrating living heritage in education? And more so, what do you think is required so that really we can take this work to scale, that it's not just individual projects, but that it gets anchored in education systems around the world? Please, over to you, Hela.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and good morning to colleagues in the room and also esteemed panelists. I want to thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I'm very, very sorry not to be there in person, but at least I'm here with you online from South Africa. So a good morning to everyone. I'll just start with just reflecting a little bit on our work with teacher educators particularly, but also teachers. I am in an education faculty, and so our main work is actually with educators. So working with teachers, teacher educators, and also educators that are not always recognized as formal teachers, but educators who play a very important role in communities. We've been working a lot over the years with educators to support them in order to be able to take on many of the new challenges that are facing our societies around the world. And so we've become very interested in, you know, SDG 4, particularly target 4.7, which recognizes that culture is the foundation of transformative education and also, of course, sustainability and human well-being. And so for us, it's a very important area to be thinking about and to work on with teachers in order to understand the full meaning of that. And so we've taken, a strongly engaged approach in which we recognize the valuable role of teachers in our society, because our teachers are also becoming increasingly undervalued. And we see that teachers hold the key to quality contextualized education. But we also note that for this, they need to be supported very well from a systemic perspective. So I want to talk just a little bit about, that sort of space of the teacher, but also the systemic support that teachers need. So what we've been trying to do is to address this problem, and I think it's a problem in many countries, that culture, and especially ICH, is not well interpreted in the education system at policy levels, but also at practice levels. It's been neglected, largely neglected. It's been undervalued, and it's even been disregarded, particularly in countries that have been impacted by colonizations, such as many of the Southern African countries, in fact, most of the African countries and elsewhere. So this history of neglect, if I can call it that, and exclusion and marginalization has got ramifications for all education activities within the lifelong learning system and the work of all educators, and it impacts on the learning process itself, which is why it's so important. So this neglect affects learners' abilities to be successful in learning, and it leaves many, 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 many millions of learners alienated in and from the education system. And this is what I would say is a major learning crisis around the world, that learners are learning in ways that are alienated from their communities, their cultures, their families, and their life worlds. And this is a very serious problem. It's a very serious neglect. So we've realized, in our research that it's not only in SADC that this is happening, but it's happening actually the world over, as we've also heard a bit this morning. And one of the problems is that it's poorly articulated in national curriculums, and teachers, of course, have to teach the national curriculum. So if the national curriculum is poorly articulated or developed, then the teachers are left with an impoverished curriculum, which is how we're actually talking about it here. And of course, these areas are also absent in TVET systems. So it's not only the formal schooling system, the TVET system itself doesn't have curricula that advance the safeguarding of ICH, doesn't develop the cultural foundations of learning well. And it also doesn't advance cultural development actually strongly in our societies, except in very, very limited ways. So we found that there are limited ICH study programs even in our universities, and there's also not enough support to advance non-formal ICH education. So we think that there's a very, very big area of neglect in the entire education and training system, including higher education, non-formal education. And so we think that, focusing in on the teacher can help us to, open up this big neglect, and then also look at how to respond. So one of the things that we've seen in our work with teachers and teacher education is that the power and the potential of ICH for advancing contextualized quality education is underdeveloped. And it also then leaves teachers underprepared for their role in working with ICH in education and for advancing contextualized quality education. And so it requires quite a lot of innovation in the work that one does with teachers, teacher educators, and of course one is always so amazed by the teachers and the teacher educators themselves as soon as they get involved in culture and ICH, how innovative they actually become as the school opens up into the community and the university opens into its community and the TVET colleges open into their communities, and you get this amazing enrichment of learning, education, and pedagogy that unfolds. So we think that, teachers and particularly teacher educators are important to focus on because they're often neglected. So we have a lot of policy changes, but we forget that about the teacher educators who are teaching the next generation of teachers. And these teachers are the ones that also reach the learners. So there's a system there that is very important, system of connection that we should not neglect as we take forward this kind of work. And these teachers, teachers sit in the middle. They sit in the middle of much. They sit in the middle of between the children and the parents, between the schools and communities, between knowledge systems, and also what meaning making is for learners. A teacher is the one who sits at that interface. And so, they play this very important role in our societies. So what we've been trying to do is to think about how do we then support teachers in a more systemic way to do this important work, and also what is the rationale and how do we develop the rationale for that. So evidence from our work with teachers and teacher educators shows that integrating ICH in education contributes to an increased sense of belonging and pride in the community, to well-being. It's vital for peace building, as we've just heard, for global citizenship, as well as sustainable development. So it's very, very important for transformative aspects of our society. It adds relevance to education. I think Suzanne's already mentioned that, and we heard that earlier as well. But what is important is that it allows learners to conceptualize the world creatively and contextually from the cultures and the context of their life worlds, while it still enables them to explore the broader world that surrounds them. And this is very important actually for, success in what we mean by success in learning. So it's not, I don't think it's discussed enough, but there is evidence that ICH can increase learners' confidence in learning. In other words, their capabilities to learn, it strengthens relationality, it strengthens values development, it strengthens social emotional learning, cognitive development, creativity, empathy, the enjoyment in learning, which is so important. But, associated with all of this is that it strengthens learner achievement because it facilitates meaning making through the contextualization of learning. And given the context of education today, this idea of the learning crisis, I think we should not underestimate the significance of this. And so I think we must, just continue with the work of supporting teachers and, support them to, continue the work that they are doing and can do to strengthen language learning, science education, environmental education, arts education, and so on with ICH, as we've also heard earlier from in our panel this morning. So in terms of systemic, what needs to be done at a systemic level? And, we've looked, I think there's a lot to a system. There's different levels, of course, to a system. So I'm just going to quickly look at the level of policy. We think that we need much more advocacy and policy support and intersectoral cooperation, particularly between ministries of education and culture, but also the ministries involved with advancing sustainable development and peace. So ministries of environment, ministries of justice, and so on could also be involved in these discussions. We need capacity building for the policy actors, because policy actors themselves don't always have a good sense of the importance and the value of integrating ICH into education in all its levels, the TVET, higher education, schooling, non-formal, and so on. We also think that we need to support teachers to be part of localized curriculum development. So it's not only the policymakers that make curriculum, but teachers need to also be given space there. And then, of course, there's the non-formal educators, and to understand and also recognize them in society also needs, policy understanding of this work. And then if we want to mainstream and scale, as Suzanne was asking, we need to do this work at the policy level, but we also need to be developing the practice at the practice level. So the work of the teachers that we've already heard about today, how teachers both teach ICH and integrate ICH, how they cross boundaries between the formal and informal education spheres, how they enrich classroom experience with place-based engagements, and also how they assess meaningful learning as it emerges from the engagements with ICH is of course very important. And that involves also transforming our very concept of assessment and also success, and therefore also quality, what quality education actually means. It cannot only mean what comes out of a PISA test. It must mean what is important in learners' lives and their communities.
Thank
of course,
you
that
so
has
much,
implications
Hela. I
for
think we need to.
textbooks and I think I'm done. Thank you.
Sorry. No, please conclude. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, of course, there's a lot in there still in terms of pedagogy and assessment and many other things that teachers are responsible for. But ultimately, I think it's very important for us to give attention to the teacher, but the teacher in the system that it itself needs to transform around the teacher, not leave everything just to the teacher. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hela, for this wonderful little presentation lecture on with so many ideas also of what we can do and conceptualizing this whole work of how we can integrate this more sustainably, the living heritage in education systems. I see that Badri Bahadur Tarang was actually nodding, so I suspect this spoke to you too, this experience from Africa. So thank you so much. I will then turn to our next speaker, c'est Son Excellence Monsieur Samir Adare de Maroc. So, Your Excellency, you are the ambassador, the permanent delegate of the Kingdom of Morocco to UNESCO, representing the country's interests globally in education, science, culture, and communication. You have advanced Morocco's international relations and promoted cooperation in different positions since 1991, when you, I think, became first secretary. We have now heard from voices from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, and you're here from the Arab States region. Your Excellency, your country in particular has been very supportive of integrating living heritage in education, notably through mother tongue and multilingual education, and including also local content within the educational curriculum. Could you tell us a little bit more about the experience and how mother tongue education, multilingualism is vital for the transmission of living heritage in formal and non-formal education context? Please, His Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Suzanne. First of all, I would like to say that it's a real pleasure and honor to be here. And I would like to thank the Korean government for its kind invitation. And it's a real pleasure. I'm thrilled to be here. And seeing the kindness of the people of Korea, I'm thankful to you all. Thank you very much. Well, I'm from a different background. I'm a diplomat, of course, and even if I had the opportunity last year to chair the 17th session of the committee, but with the experience and the huge help of my dear friend Tim Curtis. And I would like to seize this opportunity, of course, to pay him a tribute, because if this convention is moving the right way, is growing, and if we have more and more countries, member states on board, it's thanks especially to him. And I would like to say it today and in front of you all. Thank you, Tim. What I would like to say to answer your question is that 20 years ago, the international community recognized for the first time the need to support a type of cultural manifestation and expression that had, until then, no legal framework of this magnitude. Today, this commemoration, and I'm very glad to hear what I've heard today, because we have learned a lot, and I would like to thank you because you gave us the opportunity to exchange on very key issues, knowing that, as it has been said by Ernesto this morning, we still are in the middle of a process. We're still working on trying to create the best conditions to implement this very important convention. So we need to exchange. We need to try to emerge ideas from the contribution of everyone. And as a diplomat, I'm very, very happy that today I've learned a lot, as I am learning for 3 years now, as I am ambassador of Morocco in UNESCO, knowing that I have been, before that, from a bilateral background. I was ambassador in Brussels, in Athens, in Cyprus, in Luxembourg, etc. But it's quite new, and I have entered a new world in UNESCO in the late 2019. And since then, I fell in love with culture especially, and especially with intangible heritage, because intangible heritage is interrogating our humanity. As it has been said this morning, it reflects and it sends us to our senses. Audrey Azoulay said this morning, of course, the intangible, you hear it, you see it, you smell it, you sense it, and you can touch it. And this humanity, it's very important. And we have to put this humanity in our educational system, which is very important. We have noticed these 2-3 last years that more and more people and countries are paying attention to intangible because it reflects our humanity, and it is more and more important. And thanks to the youth, you can see on the social media today the importance taken, but the intangible, it's quite amazing. And it's getting more and more important, and maybe it will overcome, it will be more important than the World Heritage itself. So we need to give them, we're not talking about money and means, but they need means and they need money to fulfill their duty, because it's going to take more and more importance. About the education, it is, in this regard, it is crucial to bring up one of the most essential themes that effectively links our culture and the identities as well as our future. That is, of course, living heritage and quality education. Living heritage, and I will come back to your question about the language in Morocco, because it was a very special and very amazing experience, by the way. Living heritage, which means practices, knowledge, artistic expressions and traditions handed down from generation to generation. It is an intangible wealth to the world and allows us to create unbreakable bonds amongst individuals and communities through the use of culture and in the hopes of strengthening our diverse human experience. As for quality education, it is the foundation on which the future of younger generations realize. It is the key to the gateway of knowledge and awareness, and it shapes responsible, critical, and tolerant citizens. These two pillars are essential, as they are for the development of our societies, can be closely intertwined and mutually empowering. The preservation of living heritage relies essentially on the transmission of practical skills. Orally or through demonstration, education is the main channel through which this living heritage is transmitted from elders to youth, providing a framework for practical and experiential learning of these traditional skills. It is in classrooms, workshops, extracurricular activities, communities at home and homes that traditional skills are transmitted, revitalized, preserved, and adapted to the challenges of the modern world. When we teach and learn about living heritage, we are doing much more than perpetuating ancient practices. We are, in fact, providing new generations with a deep connection to their roots, cultural pride, and respect for diversity. Quality education also promotes the safeguarding and recognition of traditional cultural practices, intangible knowledge and skills that are an integral part of a community's cultural identity, especially in a modern context where globalization and modernization can pose a serious threat. This educational approach also promotes mutual understanding, respect and tolerance for the traditions and values of other communities. It can imbue young people with a spirit of creativity and innovation, offering them the opportunity to interact with their culture in dynamic ways and to imagine new ways of honoring it and actively and positively partaking in its evolution. This is how we forge a generation that is capable of preserving its heritage and is aware of its importance in turn for future generations and in an inclusive and equitable way, free from all discrimination. The power of living heritage lies in its ability to foster respect for diversity and celebrate differences in accordance with universal values, and this is the spirit of the 2003 Convention. The integration of the living heritage into educational policies and strategies is now a necessity to meet the expectations and needs of future generations, all the while improving the quality and relevance of education, the appreciation of cultural diversity, and education for peace and global citizenship and sustainable development. And if you allow me, I'm going just to switch to French, just to give you some thoughts that I had during these 2-3 years, and that I want to share with the audience, but very quickly.
Il n'y a pas de problème, c'est juste, on est un peu pressé là, j'ai eu des...
D'accord, des alertes.
It's because
Non,
we're a bit
je
tight
voulais
for time. Sorry.
juste dire par rapport à la langue.
I just
vous
wanted
m'avez
to say
dit tout à
concerning the
l'heure,
language, as you said earlier
effectivement, on
on.
est passé d'une
Yes,
tradition orale.
indeed, we went
Vous
from
savez
an
que le
oral
Maroc,
tradition,
depuis
as you know,
2011, ce
Morocco,
qu'on a
since
appelé le printemps
2011,
arabe,
what we
a
call the
constitué
Arab Spring, made constitutional a second language, and it became an official language. And this official language, which is Amazigh, i.e., which covered by all of the Maghreb area, knowing that the Amazigh probably were there before the Arabs, except that indeed our laziness, cultural or institutional laziness, meant that we left aside this extremely important dimension of our identity, that we forgot it. Since then, over time, the pressure meant that we went from an oral tradition to a language today which has become officially inscribed into the Constitution of Morocco. And we're very proud of this. And this is where the question of education concerning the intangible is extremely important. And I will conclude with this. To ensure the serenity of societies, amongst others, on issues of intangibles, we need courage, and we need to integrate all of the dimensions of our identity, amongst others, the dimensions of intangible heritage, to be able to reflect the reality of the surrounding society and integrate this in its totality in the school curricula so that the next generations will be fully serene and fully comfortable in the reality of their identities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a very emotional presentation with a great deal of wisdom. And the history of Morocco, with respect to the language that you mentioned, is quite extraordinary. And I'm certain that many other countries will be inspired to take similar measures. Well, we still have one more speaker, Mr. Yao Ido, who is the director of the International Education Office in Geneva, in Switzerland. Ido and I started at UNESCO at about the same time. And I was working in education at the time, and then I changed to culture. But we continued working together because we share this passion, this conviction that we'll only get to high-quality education if we bring education and culture together. And we'll only safeguard cultural diversity if we work together between these two sectors. So, we're very happy that through UNESCO's education work that you're here with us today. Ido, you have a lot of experience at UNESCO. You were at the head of a regional office as director, and your presence is particularly important here today because your institute is responsible for the improvement of curriculums in throughout the world. And so we'd like to ask you a question. What do you think is necessary to sustainably integrate intangible cultural heritage in curricula? In your opinion, what should be done? And what is the best way to go about doing this? And what do you do in the education office for the purposes of this cause? So you have the floor, and thank you again for your participation in this panel.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. I'm very sorry not to be physically with you. I would love to do it, but unfortunately I cannot. But I'm very happy to join you online. And I would say that this is one of the positive outcome of COVID. We can attend meetings from everywhere. So I'm very happy to be here. But you said it, but let me say one word about IBE. The International Bureau of Education of UNESCO was created in 1925. In 2 years, we are going to celebrate the centenary of IBE based here in Geneva. And our mandate has been, the last UNESCO General Conference asked us to work mainly on the education quality improvement in UNESCO member states through curriculum transformation. And about your question, I would like to say that the first thing that I want to say is that integrating living heritage in education is a key step for the decolonization of education. Remember, during the Transforming Education Summit in New York last September, Antonio Guterres, in his speech, said that we must decolonize education, namely in Africa. So integrating intangible culture heritage in education is not simply important. It is a vital and indispensable to have a citizen educated but rooted in their own culture with some specific identity, but at the same time open to the modern and global world. For instance, in Africa, a critical analysis of formal school indicate that schools are the cemeteries of African local cultures, starting by the most important intangible heritage of an individual, his language. I will take only my personal experience. When I was in primary school, for instance, in a rural area, in a small village in Côte d'Ivoire, we were totally forbidden to speak our local language in school. We didn't have the right. We were allowed to speak only French, and those who were found speaking their mother tongue were severely punished. And as we all know, language is the best vehicle for any culture. And banishing a language means burying the cultures and values that go with that language. So some intangible heritage like initiation ceremonies in Africa, traditional beliefs and religious practices are considered as backward, and those like me who attend, I would say attended formal school, we become condescendent vis-a-vis some intangible and living heritage of our community. So, education is for us the best means to value, promote, and safeguard the living heritage by awareness. And a living heritage is, I would say, a very rich resource for any country to achieve sustainable development. You said it, one of the panelists said it earlier. By working through a good articulation between formal and non-formal education, education can be key for intergenerational transmission of living and intangible heritage. I would say that integrating living heritage in education can favor the following. First of all, it can increase the quality of education by making lessons more relevant and more context specific. One of the panelists said it. The second is that it can reconnect school with the community around them. In some areas in Africa, for instance, when you go to a school, the school has no contact with the community. There is a cut because the buildings are very different from the local buildings, and the language is different from the one they speak. So there is no, the school does not belong to the community. So we think that by integrating living heritage in education, it can help to reconcile education, schools, and the community. It can also foster the respect and appreciation for cultural diversity and strengthen the sense of belonging of a young man to his community. And the last thing is that it can also connect students to their past and can strengthen students on how to. My second point of your question, how can we, what need to be done? I would say that as a UN specialized agency for culture, UNESCO is tasked with safeguarding living heritage and ensuring its transmission through generations. This can only be done through formal and non-formal curricula and programs. So what is IBE doing in that sense? As a global institute in charge of curriculum and in the framework of the decolonization of education, my institute is working on the promotion of indigenous curricula that value and ensure integration in education of local cultures, traditional knowledge, tangible and intangible heritage, and also the use of local languages as medium of instruction in teaching and learning. We are also in this indigenous curriculum promotion valuing the knowledge of parents. You know, some parents in rural areas, they have a lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge, but they are not given any opportunity to share that in school. So the school is there, they don't intervene. We think that we are working on promotion of indigenous curriculum that will allow parents to have a say in the education of their kids in school. But we have to give them the opportunity to contribute to the knowledge building of their kids. In our promotion of indigenous curriculum, we also connect learners to their local values, identity, context, and also revitalizing the difference between, by reconciling the global culture and the local one. IB is pushing for living heritage to be part of official school curricula or extracurricular activities. For instance, for pedagogies, we propose more flexible curricula so that the teacher can contextualize by identifying and promoting local knowledge and living heritage through his teaching. But today, curricula are so rigid, the teacher cannot even touch anything. And we are advocating for more flexible curricula that can enable the teacher to come in. Another thing that we are supporting, for instance, in Cote d'Ivoire, there is in one region, there is one living heritage that is called Chologo. It's a traditional ceremony of initiation, after which a person is called a man or a woman. After 2 weeks in the forest for training by elders. And in that region, what is interesting is that the owner of this Chologo, who are traditional leaders, they are invited in the classroom to come and share the knowledge, the values behind this traditional heritage. And it's producing very good results. It's bringing young people to really be interested in what is going on. This practice is one of the best ways to safeguard the Chologo. In Indonesia, students are taught about batik. This is a type of handcraft textile through subjects such as chemistry, history, and art. So this brings the young people to really be interested in the batik, which is a very important living heritage for Indonesia. In Mexico, for example, also, a guide for teachers of indigenous education includes lessons on personal and community identity and living heritage. So this also brings the teachers to really address the issue of living heritage. Finally, in the advocacy of my institute, we work with member states. We urge the member states to, first of all, integrate living heritage in core curriculum subject. It has to become a curriculum subject in the programs. Secondly, we advocate so that heritage specialists are invited to school to share their knowledge. Thirdly, we are also proposing and pushing to develop and make digital heritage related to information more accessible and more user-friendly on social media for the youth, with some videos and explanation on the importance for the kids. Because one of the best challenge, and this is my last word, is that the youth today, they don't see the importance of living heritage. They don't understand. When they go to school, they become condescending and they think this is background, this is outdated behaviors and beliefs, and they don't believe in. But if we are able to explain them how this living heritage can contribute to their own education, how it contributes to build a man or a woman who is rooted in his culture before being open to the rest of the world, I think that more and more the youth will be interested, because the big challenge is how to interest the youth. And that's why I was saying that the presence of living heritage on social media through ICT is key, because as we all know, things that are on TikTok, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, etc., are the Facebook, are things that interest the youth. So how are we maximizing the presence of living heritage on social media is key to make it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ido, for this great journey or story about living heritage and education in Africa. And it's funny because your last sentence is sort of bridging the panel of today with tomorrow's panel, which will be on living heritage in the digital environment. So we will refer back to what you were just saying, because I think it's very true, in fact, and I think we've seen that with others also. I know we are, I wasn't strict enough, I think, with time. You all spoke a bit longer, but it was so interesting. And I looked at people, nobody seemed bored. So I thought, well, I think your presentations were just so strong that I didn't want to stop you. I have a question to the organizers. Can we take 1 or 2 questions, or is that still possible with the interpreters and so on? Well, let's just do that. If there is, I can take 1 or 2 questions. So there's already one over there. Ananya, please, yes. Can you also present yourself, especially for those online who weren't here earlier, because you spoke in an earlier panel?
I'm Ananya. I'm coming from India, and we are from an accredited NGO working on culture and development. I'd like to share 2 challenges we face and hear from any of the panelists whether they are facing it. One is the issue of language. In many of our indigenous communities, the languages are oral. There is no written script. So the choice of having education in that language does not exist practically. So those languages are dying. So has this been a problem? And the other is our communities are diverse across the world, and we are in the age of supra-diversity. So we have very mixed, diverse communities in all our countries. So is there any risk of pushing in the majoritarian culture, among others, in the name of ICH education? So these are the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question before I give the floor to the panelists? Yes, there's one over there. Please, if you, maybe while we get the mic to you, I already let maybe Hela and Ido could respond to this question first. Hela, would you like to do that, to respond to Ananya's question? Hela, can you hear us? Or maybe the connection is now no longer there. Ido, would you like to answer to the question that Ananya posed?
Yes. I think that the point she raised about the dying of some local language is a reality that we know. You know, UNESCO has been working on protecting dying languages. We know that many languages are dying for lack of preservation. Let me take the example of, there is one language in South Africa. I don't remember the name, but the panelists in South Africa will tell us the language where we speak, we make it. There is a click, and this language, there are 3 more speakers of the language, and they are all above 70. So if they die, it means that that language is going to die. The best way of preserving it is to make it as medium of instruction in education. And this is what we are pushing for in UNESCO, the promotion of multilingual education, valuing all the languages, making sure that no child starts school in a language different from the one he speaks at home or in his community. For instance, let me take the case of Africa. Africa is still the continent where 8 children out of 10 start school in a language different from the one they speak at home. And we are promoting multilingual education because the use of mother tongue is the best way to really promote living heritage, because the living heritage in general is possessed by people, native speakers, and they don't speak French or English. So if we are able to promote their language in education in the early years in primary school, these people can be invited to come and properly share their knowledge of living heritage, because they are the owners of the knowledge on learning heritage. So that's why we are pushing, and we think that is one of the best ways to make sure that the living heritage is really promoted through the multilingual education and the mother tongue education.
Thanks a lot, Ido. So let's take that question. There's one last question before we close, but you didn't get the microphone. Is that the issue? Where is
Hey, the mic is given to me,
mic,
so I have a question for the panel. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't see you. I'm very
my name is
sorry.
Abdo. I'm from Brunei Darussalam, very near to Korea. My question is, how can we ensure global quality education in the SDG 4 is more than just pedagogy in formal education? Because we have under informal education and non-formal education, things like andragogy and things like enculturation of cultural heritage needs to be highlighted and needs to be counted into achieving SDG goals. Thank you.
So do I understand that was more a comment, no, or a plea that we should do this? Yeah, thank you for that. And then why don't you just come over and I give you my microphone if you like? Because there, she's bringing it, okay. Yeah, we have to stop, exactly. We stop now.
Hi.
Okay.
So hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pam, and I am from Thailand. I'm currently a graduate student at Chiang Mai University, majoring in ethnicity and development. So actually, my question, I would like to address my question to Director Yao, but actually, he has already has got some questions, so it is open for every panelist to answer. So my question is about that when you mentioned about that the living heritage is like youths nowadays, they no longer interested in their own living heritage, right? But actually, as far as I understand, ICH needs to remain relevant to the community because it represents their own identity. So I just want to know, how can we, in the field of education, overcome this dilemma of youth not interested in their own living heritage while we as adults or elders are trying to like pushing this to their minds. So thank you.
Would you like to answer to that? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I think this question is very interesting, at the same time quite challenging to answer. And of course, this kind of diasporic situations are the learners, especially the learners of the from the indigenous community, learners from the marginal communities are in this kind of context. For me, what I would say is, I'm also the one who is facing this kind of situations. So I think the best way is to integrate the both cultures, since we have been talking about the global peace, since we have to respect each other. And that is what I found in my practice in the classroom. When we were talking about one culture, the ICS element of the one culture, the rest, another culture were very much interested with that. Wow. And then, when we were doing another thing, and they were also celebrating that. So, and I think that is the main motto of ICS in education. So integration, I would say, is the best way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a very clear answer. And I would like to say a big word of thanks again to all the panelists. Big applause. Yes, thank you. Thank you, by Badri, Adriana Mulano, Kayla Lotz, the ambassador from Morocco, and also Ido Yao for your for this rich discussion. And I think I hand over then to our organizers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your discussion. That was very inspiring.
Thank you very much for the panel discussion. We talked about recognizing cultural diversity and raising awareness on the importance of ICH and the integration of ICH with education. This is really important, especially when we think about promoting intangible cultural diversity going forward for the next decade. This is going to be critical. With that, we would like to wrap up day one of the global meeting of the 20th anniversary celebration for the convention. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us until the end of day one, and I will see you again tomorrow morning at 9:30. Thank you.